Welcome, everyone. Nice to see you all here. My name is Mikey Mhenna. I'm the Executive Director of Afikra. Thanks for joining today's event. It's my honor to welcome our esteemed guest. Dr. Akram Khater is the University Faculty Scholar, Professor of History, and holds the Khayrallah Chair in Diaspora Studies at the North Carolina State University, where he also serves as the Director of the Khayrallah Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies. A native of Lebanon, he earned a BS degree in electrical engineering from California Polytechnic State University and holds an MA and PhD degrees in history from the University of California, Santa Cruz and Berkeley, respectively. His books include Inventing Home, Immigration, Gender, and the Making of the Lebanese Middle Class, 1861 to 1921, and A History of the Middle East, a source book for the history of the Middle East and North Africa, as well as Embracing the Divine, Passion, and Politics in the Christian Middle East. He's produced multiple documentaries, including Cedars in the Pines with PBS and the Lebanese America, and has just completed a new award-winning documentary titled The Romey Lynchings. We're going to be talking about that and more. Akram is an award-winning scholar and has taught and spoken all over the world. It is our honor to welcome him to Afikra Conversations. Akram, welcome to Afikra Conversations.
Thank you so much, Mikey. It's a pleasure to be here and to be with everyone.
Well, you know, I wanted to start with a question that is biographical, because a lot of the work that you're doing, as is obvious in your bio, is about the diaspora, and in particular about the diaspora in America. As I was researching you, I realized that you were born in Lebanon, but your childhood was spent between Lebanon, Egypt, and Senegal in the 60s and 70s. Interestingly, not in America. So when did you first become interested in the quote unquote diaspora? Did you think you were living in the diaspora as a kid?
So first, just a very brief correction, because it'll help explain a little bit my background. My childhood was all in Lebanon. I left Lebanon when I was 18.
Oh, okay.
So I went to Senegal after I had come to the United States, and I went to Egypt after I had come to the United States. And so my childhood was spent all in Lebanon. I grew up in Lebanon. I went to school in Lebanon, and I left Lebanon because of the Civil War. And in answer to your question, no, my horizons were the Mediterranean shore. That was it. I mean, to my mind, my biggest ambition was to, when I decided to go study, was to go follow in the footsteps of my oldest brother, who went in the 60s to United Kingdom, to England, to get his PhD in physics there. So I thought I wanted to go there, but obviously at that time, Britain had cut severely back on scholarships to foreign students. So I ended up getting a scholarship in the United States, and I left. But I really, within our family, we didn't talk about immigration. We didn't talk about leaving. I had an uncle who worked in Kuwait in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So I knew that people worked outside Lebanon, but it wasn't anything on my, personal horizon.
Where in Lebanon did you grow up, just for context?
So I like to say I grew up all over Lebanon, because my father was in the Darak, or, for those of you who don't know the term Darak, gendarme, or the internal security forces of Lebanon. I don't think he was very well politically connected, because we got posted to, at that point, what would be considered to be, the more remote areas of Lebanon. So we were in Marjayoun, Nabatieh, Baalbek. We were not anywhere in the center, Beirut or anything like that. But I have to say that was amazing, because I got to grow up in these amazing places that I loved, especially in Nabatieh. But then he retired, and we moved to Hadad, which is a suburb of Beirut, because that's where he wanted to retire, to be close to school, better schools, and so that's where I spent most of my childhood.
Okay, interesting. And so you didn't have uncles and aunts and cousins who had emigrated in the 20s or the turn of the century that were in Oklahoma or something like that?
No, I mean, quite honestly, I didn't know anybody who had immigrated to America. There wasn't anybody in our family. The closest person to leave Lebanon was, again, my uncle, who went in the 50s when oil was becoming a thing in the Gulf. He went to Kuwait to work for what was known then as BOAC, British Overseas Airways Corporation. That ultimately then he moved on to Kuwait Airways itself. And so that was the extent of my knowledge of distance, if you will. But America was nowhere in the horizon. I hadn't even thought about it.
Okay, so you go to the States, and we're going to start getting into your scholarship in a second, but this is related. You go to the States like a good Lebanese or Arab boy, you become an engineer. Was it a facade? Was it a con? Did you know that you were going to become a historian and a scholar the entire time, and you were just checking the box for the parents?
No, not at all. I mean, listen, honestly, I wasn't even 18. I was 17. I was very fortunate because an organization called Immigrants, which is based in DC, was able to, because my parents were of very modest means, there was no way I could leave. And my intention was always to go to AUB or Lebanese University, whichever one would. But because of the civil war in Lebanon, I couldn't cross to AUB, and Lebanese University was also not in the best shape. I mean, although it was very close to our house, the campus. So I applied, I took my, SATs, I took my ACTs, I took TOEFL, and I had wonderful people in Beirut working for MDs who helped find a scholarship for me. And, I only knew two options. Like, I think most of us of that generation, and perhaps even now, you could either be a doctor or an engineer to be a member of the middle class in Lebanon, to go up. And so that was kind of the aspirational goal, so to speak. And I had seen enough blood in the Lebanese Civil War that I wanted nothing to do with medicine. The war was traumatic to all of us at so many different levels, and we can talk more about that, of course. And so I thought I'd do engineering, and electronic engineering, what we now call computer engineering, seemed to be the thing to do. Again, I don't think there was a whole lot of intentionality, and I'm borrowing that word from you, Mikey. I went with the flow, so to speak. I went to St. Paul, Minnesota with a sweater. That tells you how little intentionality I have. For those of you who have never been in Minnesota, it's like the Siberia of the United States. And I remember that the irony of it is my brother had to send me one of those parkas that extend far out when in the Arctic parkas, but he sent it from Kuwait. So I thought, really, this is on the height of irony. No, so I studied engineering because, I really fully expected to go back to Lebanon. But my parents died, both of them. And I think those of you who have suffered loss, my parents died within 40 days of each other. Within a year of my arrival in Lebanon and the United States. And I'm sorry to get too personal here, but I think it helps explain. I have to honestly say that it completely unmoored me. I just was lost without my parents. I didn't know what to do. I just stumbled through the degree. I finished my degree. I worked. But at that point, there was, to be honest, no reason for me to go back to Lebanon because there was only pain and, loss. And so I started working for Intel Corporation because, again, it's not something I really wanted to do any more than engineering, but it's something I was trained to do, and I liked it enough, But then I really got bored. And I think partly it's because I wasn't that great of an engineer. I mean, I was going to be a good engineer. I'll do my job, I'll get my paycheck, and I'll be a good engineer, but I wasn't going to be like some sort of brilliant engineer. It didn't excite any passion in me. So I took a night course. Familiar. I know you and I had this conversation. So I took a night course, and I was living at that point in California, in Santa Cruz, California, and I took an evening course called Islamic Responses to Imperialism. It's a history course with ultimately the person who would become my advisor, or one of my advisors, Dr. Terry Burke. And I just fell in love with it. Now, a precursor to that, when I was doing my engineering degree, I also did a minor in women gender studies. And that was where I really found my intellectual passion. It seemed to excite me a lot more than the engineering courses. So because I didn't have any responsibilities, and I think that was a privilege, in a horrible, tragic way, I got to a position after losing my parents that I didn't feel obliged to have a job, that I would have to worry about my parents. So tragically, I had privilege, so to speak. And I thought, I'm going to just drop out. My brother, who was a physicist, didn't speak to me for 2 years after that because he was so pissed off at this decision, thinking, what the heck are you going to do with a history degree? Which, to a certain extent, I can understand his point. But that's how I became impassioned by and really interested in history.
You have to be aware of the ire of siblings. They're very, very judging.
I'm happy to record we're talking now, so it's good.
right before the call, we were talking earlier, and as I was looking into your early scholarship, I noticed that most of the work that you were doing was focused on women's issues. Some of the articles that you wrote at Egyptian Feminism Today, the women's movement and political participation in the model in modern Egypt, and then your PhD eventually became focused on the silk industry and sort of the rise and the downfall of the silk industry in the 19th century. But I have to ask you about the title. It's She Married Silk. Why is it She Married Silk? What is the relevance of that title?
So I'll answer that, and then I'll go back to talk a little bit about how I got interested in
please.
social history and specifically in gender. She married silk was an expression in the late 19th century to indicate that she married money. So within villages, usually these are marriages that are happening within extended family circles that are negotiated between families. And there's a whole performative aspect to it, a theater, if you will, that we know about from records from the 19th century, in which people talk about usli ufusli, where I come from and my legacy. And in some ways that begins to shift as money becomes also not only a more important measure of status in some ways. And so the term becomes she married silk, indicating that she's marrying men. Look, I mean, to me, I think where I began interested in women's history and gender history in general was in my mother's kitchen. Because I would find that in my mother's kitchen, not only do you get excellent food, but also it was the hub of the social environment within our neighborhood. And I think anybody growing up, not only in Lebanon, by the way, but any, non-Western society where there's still a very intimate and almost suffocating at times kind of social life, well, they go hand in hand. I mean, there's a cocoon and then suffocation at the same time. Would know this. I mean, there are all these women from the neighborhood coming through, having a cup of coffee, helping my mom chop parsley for tabbouleh, talking, then they leave and come back. In comparison, the men were so boring. I mean, they're playing backgammon and talking about the politics or what have you, but the women were talking about the day-to-day life. So it was always very interesting to me because it seemed that's where the substance of life is, right? And yet at the same time, both in schooling in Lebanon, and then even afterwards when I started studying history of the Middle East, was so much focused on the same, stale political history and military history. And social history was, of course, in the 1970s and 80s in Europe and the United States was taking off, but Middle Eastern history was just beginning to explore social history in the 1990s. And I was always curious about gender relations. I remember a conversation with some friends about why it is that, when a guy, and I'm sorry if I'm going to be a little blunt here, but I remember I was like 15 and I would ask my friends, like, why is it when a guy goes out with a lot of women, he's a stud? But if a girl goes out with more one guy, she's considered to be a quote unquote fallen woman or worse language. It just didn't make sense to me. And they would give me explanations about ayib, shame on something or honor. And it just made no sense. So even as, an unsophisticated teenager, I saw gender as a social construct that didn't have any natural roles one way or the other. And so all of those things kind of came together. And then when I began taking courses as an undergraduate in women and gender studies, I remember the first course I took is like somebody turned on a light bulb. And I was like, drinking from a fire hydrant. I was amazed by the power of the humanities to explain things that I couldn't get. And so that took me in that general direction. And in many ways also the experience in the Civil War helped a lot. I mean, in the sense that it helped push me in that direction, because I really wanted to understand what happened in Lebanon that destroyed my life in some ways, just killed my parents, and destroyed a society that I grew up with. Perhaps I'm being nostalgic here, but I grew up with a lot of wonderful things. Even though we didn't have money, there was still an amazing amount of life there. I wanted to understand that, and I felt that history is so much more important in that than engineering. So I took that direction.
And in what ways did your initial scholarship help you try to answer that question around what happened to this middle class? How did we get to a point in the mid 70s where bullets were actually flying.
Yeah. So again, to be honest, I never got to that point because I got stuck in the 19th and early 20th century. But I think what it helped me begin to understand is this construction of Lebanon in a very sectarian fashion that obviously predates 1975 by a long period. But what began to appear in Lebanon is that you have two layers. One, the top layer that looked like an incredibly modern facade, right? I mean, if you went to Hamra in 1970 or Tujuni, you would see this kind of, and I love the photos that you have. I mean, you just, if you went to the St. George Hotel in 1969, right? I mean, this kind of
iconic bikini photos.
Exactly, right? I mean, the sort of the cliche of Lebanon as Paris or, the Middle East or, and there's an element of truth in that, of course, if you had money. But that was the facade. But beneath it all, there was an element that we never really dealt with, which is the tribalism of Lebanon, that just kind of thing. And I don't think Lebanon is unique, by the way. I don't mean to say there's something wrong with us, but there's a tension there. And the biggest problem is that the tension was never really fully acknowledged. Now, again, I'm working on a new project, which is a long history of the state in Lebanon from early 1900 to 1975 when it collapsed. And that's much more of a direct. I think also I have to answer more honestly, is I think to immediately engage the Civil War was proving to be painful. And I retreated to the 19th and early 20th century. I mean, if I'm going to be really honest about this, and in fact, early on, I wanted to do Egyptian history, not Lebanese history. I kind of was, on one hand, I wanted to know, but on the other hand, it was just too painful, honestly, to see to experience and to know what the war had wrought. And I kind of kept it at a distance. I think now I'm much more comfortable going back and doing it. But for a while, I thought I was going to be a historian of Egypt. And I trained to be a historian of Egypt, actually.
Yeah. Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit to this idea of once you start really focusing on emigration. And there's a saying that I always say in the afikra world, because people always ask me like, oh, what percentage of the afikra community is in the diaspora? To which I always reply, we are all in the diaspora.
Yeah.
Because there's no such thing as the diaspora, I think, because people are coming and going in and out of the region, internally in the region, and once you zoom out past, like, beyond 1950 and sort of zoom out, you realize that this is a fluid place. And so this first book, Inventing Home, Immigration, Gender, and the Middle Class in Lebanon, 1870 to 1920, at first glance, if you just look at the cover, says, oh, this is about people leaving the region. But it's not only about that. This book is about them leaving and then coming back and then informing the region, and then this sort of revolving door. My question is, was that the book that you intended to write to begin with, or was that something that you sort of discovered as you started doing the research?
First of all, I love your description or answer to this notion about how many people in diaspora, how many people in Lebanon. It's a very correct answer in many ways, and I'll explore that in just a bit. When I did my dissertation, I was really interested in the social history of what we know as Mount Lebanon, the central area that still today is called, Jabal Lebanon, Muhafaza Jabal Lebanon. So I was interested in that, doing that social history. And I didn't want to do a history of the elites. Most of the histories, well, in fact, all the histories I encountered when I was in graduate school were about the power brokers, the financial political elites. I wanted to do a history of the people, so to speak. And to understand what is going on beyond the 1860 Civil War, which every study had focused on. I wanted to understand what was going on within these villages and towns in the mountains, and Beirut, of course, because there's an intimate relationship. And so silk became the sector or the vector through which I did that study, my dissertation, and trying to understand how this growth and then ultimately collapse of this industry reshaped day-to-day life for these individuals. So I really, what we like to call history from the bottom up. The last part of that dissertation was that with the collapse of the silk industry in the late 19th century, you begin to see people not the really poverty-stricken, not the very poor, but the sort of middling peasants, the people who have enough money, but who are going to start sliding backwards. They begin to look for ways to shore up their income, and immigration was one of the major ways to do that. So then when I got my job here, then I wrote, in essence, took the first chapter and expanded it in a new manuscript, which is Inventing Home. And in many ways, it's also my own personal experience with immigration that I have to say that helped shape this book. Because what I realized very quickly is there's this old narrative about immigration in which people leave a space and then go to another space, leave a country and enter another country. And their story somehow is cut off in the middle, because the minute, we can tell their story as long as they're in Lebanon, but the minute they come to the United States, they belong here. In reality, they all live transnationally, like all of us here. We flow. Even if we physically don't flow, we still flow, right? So I remember, I had a bunch of friends at Cal Poly Pomona where I did my undergraduate in engineering. I mean, we would coalesce around the cafeteria lunch table and talk. And then when we made tabbouleh, not very well, it was a process that was, while we were in California, was transporting us, memory-wise to how we grew up. So we existed transnationally even when we weren't traveling. And I also realized very quickly, one of the things I grew up knowing about mate, a drink that I associated with the Druze community in Lebanon. It turned out mate was coming all the way from, Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. I didn't know that. And so I was beginning to ask questions like, what did other people bring? And so I began to realize that what we take to be Lebanon is as much shaped by this, circulating group of people as it is by the people there. And that was, again, I'm using your term here, very intentional, because one of the problems about nationalist histories is they try to close off the story within artificial geographic boundaries. That is, Lebanese history only exists within 10,420 square miles, kilometers. In fact, any moment you look at it, that history is about circulation, about ideas, people, and commodities flowing in and flowing out. And you cannot understand Lebanon that way. And then it's that in many ways, nationalist history is very bigoted because it is closed-minded. And I think that in some ways also was part of the reason I did this, is because this idea that somehow, that the Lebanese are exceptional from everywhere around it, is nonsense. It's really nonsense. We are flowing in and out. Look, just very quickly, my cousin just did his DNA, right? So he's 50% Arab, 35% Italian, Greek, and then 20, the rest of that, whatever it is, Yemeni Jew, right? It's like, even at the level of the DNA, there's no that kind of purity. And so that's why I really ultimately ended up doing Inventing Home.
For sure. Okay, there's a million questions I can ask, but I want to move on. I'm looking at the time. For now, I'm going to try to come back to sources in the Middle East, in the modern Middle East, and come to this book, which I was really, really curious about. Embracing the Divine, Passion and Politics in the Christian Middle East. For those of you who are listening to the podcast later and are not looking at the screen, I'm pulling a quote from an interview you did where it said, "It seemed to me that we were entering a neo-Orientalist phase that was certainly more sophisticated, but that still reduced the complexity of the region to Islam. This preoccupation completely elided non-Muslims from any role in the history and society of the region, which struck me as completely at odds with the realities on the ground." This was you talking about some of the reasons that sort of pushed you to start this project. But I'd love for you to tell the story of how you discovered this story, what the book is about, and why you think the book really needed to exist.
Well, in one way, the book is about the woman that you see in the picture, Hindi al-Ujaymi, who's originally from Halab, Aleppo. I was sitting at the Bibliothèque Nationale doing research for my dissertation. And quite honestly, I was bored with what I was reading. So I went to their, very nostalgic here, card catalog. And I was flipping through. And then I came across this one index card that in Arabic had on it, "The Strangest Woman in the World." I mean, with a title like that, of course, I had to order that manuscript. And I ordered the manuscript. And it turned out to be a polemical attack on Hindi al-Ujaimi. And like a lot of researchers in any kind of field, you accumulate ideas, but sometimes you don't go back to them for a while. So that one went to the real back burner. And then later on, I had the opportunity to go to Rome to start digging into her story, to go to Lebanon and to go to Syria and dig into her story. So in some ways, it's her story, but really it's not just about that. Primarily, it's about how Christianity, and very specifically here, Maronite Christianity, was being constructed in the 18th century, in the 1700s, as it is coming to terms with itself and its relationship to Rome. And in many ways, it's about this woman who claims that she has direct communications with Christ. And that gives her an authority that transcends the patriarchal hierarchy of the Catholic Church, from Rome to Kirke, the seat of the Maronite Patriarchate. So in essence, she's saying all your scriptures, all your hierarchies are not as important as the fact that Jesus told me to do A, B, or C, X, Y, or Z. The issue isn't whether Jesus spoke to her or not. I really don't care about that. The issue is, because she claimed that kind of religious authority that women, formally were not allowed, she became the center of a huge attack by the Jesuits and by Rome, right? And to a certain extent by members of the Maronite Church, because she ignited this big storm about who holds religious authority, who provides that. And in some ways, she challenged the very foundation of the patriarchal hierarchy within the Catholic Church. And for that, she incurred the wrath of them and 2 inquisitions. The first one, go ahead.
Is that something that Maronites in Halab or in surrounding areas knew? Is this sort of like an internal strife, or is this something that's actually affecting churchgoers every Sunday?
No, it's not just an internal strife. I mean, people in the time period knew about her. And in fact, she split the community in half. She becomes a lightning rod for a lot of other issues, but certainly about that. And she also have, there are other nuns that follow her, or religious associations that follow her at Halab. Halab was a very interesting center for Maronite theology, by the way. We tend to think of Lebanon, but Halab had a much more powerful center in the 18th century. But what happened very quickly is that they buried the story. Once she was put in jail, they buried the story.
Okay, I'm seeing the time. I want to move on. Let's talk about the center. So the center's name is the Moise. Is Moise? Is that the first name?
Moise. It's the French pronunciation, Moise.
Moise, Khayrallah Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies. As I was speaking to you before the call, you mentioned to me that sort of the initial project started around 2010, but later on was formed into an official center. What is the mandate of this center, and has that changed over the last sort of decade since its initial conception?
So, the mandate is quite simple, really. It is preserving the history of Lebanese immigration and diaspora, and then sharing it with the general public and scholars alike. That's basically what we do. 10 years ago, we started with a pilot project. The person after whom it's named, Moise Khayrallah, he and I had a long-standing friendship, and we attend all the, community things, independence, Valentine's, and it's always tabbouleh and dabki, tabbouleh and dabki, tabbouleh and dabki, right? The same thing. So one time we were having coffee, and he said, "I am so tired of tabbouleh and dabki. We got to do something different."
Amen.
So I said to him, "Look, we can do something a little bit more, historical, cultural, what have you." And I proposed to him that we do a pilot project in which we collect oral histories from Lebanese in North Carolina, those who are newcomers and those who came, descended from people who came in the 1890s and 1900s. And we did that. We did a documentary called Cedars and the Pines, because the pine is the tree of North Carolina, and then cedars obviously is a Lebanese tree par excellence. And then we did a museum exhibit by the same name, which toured, and they both were very highly successful. Just very briefly, and I have my wife to thank for this. Originally, when we wanted to premiere the documentary, and let me add here, the documentary is not a brilliant documentary. It's fine. It tells a story. I can see 50 holes I could fix right now. But my wife said, "Look, you don't premiere it at the university. Premiere it at the North Carolina Museum of History, right? This edifice that's dedicated to the history. Put them there. And so we did. And we had an overflow. We had about 350 people show up in a theater that could only seat 290. The fire marshal was really upset with me. At the end of it, I am not exaggerating when I say about half of the people were crying. Not crying because it's such a brilliant documentary, but crying because for the first time, their private stories are on the that screen, are public in an institution called the Museum of History of North Carolina. They're things that have been in essence marginalized are now being public. And that's the power of public history, in which you take these stories and you engage the general public with it. And that's what we do. So it was so successful, and the exhibit itself was equally successful, that Moyi said, let's make this permanent. And he was generous enough to endow the center, and the center expanded beyond North Carolina to include the United States. And actually, we are now working in South America as well.
So I want to ask a question about the title. My great-grandparents on my mom's side were all immigrants that moved to the U.S., all over the U.S., actually in Canada and the U.S. They all ended up mostly around Michigan. And all three of them were from what is now called Lebanon. And one of them is from now, a place from what is now called Syria. All of them said they were Syrian, right?
Yeah.
If you ask them in the 1950s, where are you from? They'd say, I'm from Maj'ayun, Syria, right? Why is it called the Lebanese Immigrants?
It's a very good question. And you're absolutely right. Look, I think the term is misleading because we don't just really only focus on Lebanese. We focus on people who come from what we now know as Greater Syria or Bilad al-Sham. And that's exactly how they knew themselves. The truth of the matter is, by the way, people never immigrate from country to country. They immigrate from town or village to another town or village. So what you just said is exactly right. They would tell you, I'm from Marja'yun. Syria is an afterthought. Lebanon is an afterthought. So if we're really going to be honest, these folks only came to understand themselves in a bigger identity when they came to the United States, and then they had to give Ellis Island or the crossing at El Paso, Texas, some sort of bigger entity, and then they said Syria. Not Syria in the modern nation-state term that we understand, but Syria as, again, encompassing Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria today. The reason we use the term Lebanese is twofold. Is that the great majority of the folks who came here in the early part of the 20th century and in the late part of the 19th century are from what we know today, Lebanon. We estimate somewhere around 80 to 82% were from that area, with the rest coming from Damascus and Hama, Homs, Halab, and Palestine. But the other reason, I'm going to be very honest here, is that the donor wanted it to be called Lebanese.
Sure.
Right? And that's in essence, because originally I had been pushing for more Arab, a larger term to kind of encompass it. But of course, every term has its own problems, but that's why we did it. And as you can see and I'm glad you're showing this slide, because, this is a short essay I wrote to very much undermine or to destabilize any identities, because they were always in flux.
So I want to just show, I don't really have a question about it, but I want to make a recommendation for anyone on the call to really check out this beautiful exhibit that is dripping with information called Turath. If you just go to the website, it's right there. It's fantastic. There's so much information on it. But before we go to the quick Q&A, I want to talk about the Romey lynchings, terrorizing immigrants, which is a documentary that came out recently. Tell me about how you discovered this story. What inspired you to turn this into a documentary,
Sure.
and a little bit about the story itself.
So again, it's when I was doing research for my book, the Inventing Home one, I was sitting at the New York Public Library and I was going through microfilm, and I came across an article in Al Huda, which is one of the earliest Arab American publication, first published in Philadelphia, but then moved to New York on Washington Street. And it was about the lynching incident here. I read through it quickly, but it wasn't something that I actually was going to engage with at that point because I was going in a different direction, and I put it aside then. But then my colleague, Sarah Gualtieri, Dr. Sarah Gualtieri at the University of Southern California, wrote a book about race and Arabs, early Arabs. And one of the chapters of the book was about her, about this incident. So that kind of reignited my interest in this. And, you know, the reason we wanted to do this is several, are two main reasons. One is far too often the immigrant narrative, especially the ones we like to tell about the Lebanese, is we came, we worked, we succeeded. That's it. It's a wonderfully linear, and I'm not saying people didn't do that. Of course, some people did that, but there's so much richness in between, including tragedies. And I think we try to, you know, we tend to avoid telling the stories of Lebanese immigration as filled with failure, tragedy, setbacks, disease, abuse. I mean, life, filled with life. We flatten it. We create this incredibly cartoonish notion. And in doing so, we actually dehumanize and we rob ourselves from the story, because immigration is hard. I mean, I'm sorry, immigration is very hard. You're moving away from things that you're familiar with more often than not. Yeah, of course, sometimes you're escaping that. But even when you're escaping it, like I did with the Civil War, it tears something out of your heart. It takes you out of something and forces you to go somewhere else, where at best you're tolerated, but more often than not, you're not really that welcome. And so there is a challenge to this, and we have to acknowledge that. So we wanted to tell that story. But two, this is not just a story about the 1929 incident in Lake City, Florida. This is about an arc, narrative arc, about racialization and racism against Arabs, including the shooting of a Lebanese engineer in Oklahoma in 2016, right? Including my daughter being asked, you know, if you know, I'm going to be bombing something anytime soon. This kind of stuff is part of who we are. We have to acknowledge it as Arab Americans and really as Lebanese Americans. The story, in short, is about this couple that comes from an area known as Deir al-Ahmar in the Biqa Valley. And they arrive first in Valdosta, Georgia, then they make their way to a small town called Lake City, Florida, where they're the only other Lebanese family. The other one is the Musa family, and they're related to them. And they open up a store and they try everything they can to fit in. The problem is the local sheriff and the local police chief are, you know, really not happy with them for a variety of reasons, not least of which is that they are not accepting the racial system. And the racial system basically said, if you're white, you have certain privileges. If you're not white, you have to acknowledge those privileges. For example, and you see this a lot with lynchings, especially African Americans. One of the main causes is that he talked to a white woman. He accosted a white woman. This kind of sexual transgression that is the anxiety of this. Or he talked back. That is a person who basically proclaimed their humanity in the face of somebody trying to dehumanize them. And the same thing happens with the Romeys. Hannah, or she calls herself Fanny in English, and then Ula, Romey, really would not accept the authority of the police and their injustice, anywhere from telling them to take their fruits and vegetables off the sidewalk when they didn't tell anybody else, to in essence trying to extort them. And so in that sense, they become alien and outside, and therefore they're okay to kill them. And they did. They killed both of them. So it's a very tragic story. And we did it, and I'm very, very grateful to the families that allowed us into the story, because the families wanted that story told.
This was the KKK?
They definitely were the KKK. I mean, there were men who came. So Ula was in the prison, in the cell. He was locked up in the city jail, which is run by the police. And a group of KKK came in and dragged him out of the jail, took him out of town, and shot him multiple times outside. Many people said that members of the KKK were actually, I mean, the police and the sheriff, some of the sheriff deputies were members of the KKK. And that's very widely known, by the way.
Yeah.
That the police within the South especially, but not only the South, emerges as a way to protect the white supremacy.
Yeah. Okay. I want to get to the quick Q&A and then open it up to the chat. So we'll do these first 4 questions. What are you reading or watching right now?
Right now, I've just been almost done with a book called Banking on the State by Hisham Safiyuddin, which is a wonderful and first book that looks at the history of the banking system in Lebanon from the Mandate period all the way to now. and couldn't be more timely because it helps explain why we're in this financial mess in some ways.
Oh,
And one of the best chapters, if you don't want to read the whole book, is the one on the interbank, which is
Interbank, of course.
Yes,
Yusuf Baidas.
yes. And there's a wonderful chapter with a really excellent first-rate primary search that he did. So I would recommend it.
Okay, I need to speak to this person, by the way. Okay.
Yes, Hisham is very excellent.
Okay, who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
I would love to shadow the Mars Perseverance team. They're the ones who landed the Newslander. I am in the humanities, but I remain very much
the science nerd emerges.
Yes. I actually at one point deciding between I was deciding between history and astrophysics for my PhD because I still love physics. So that's who I would want to shadow, is the folks at JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab.
Cool. What do people most misunderstand about your work?
They think that the center is about celebrating Lebanese diaspora, that is the triumphalist story. And they think that all of our work is about showing that the Lebanese are the best immigrants in the world. And it's not.
Okay, great. Whose work do you admire or are inspired by?
There are obviously many.
Yeah.
But I think I would say most recently, it's the Lebanese Association for History, which is a group of teachers and some university professors, but mostly teachers and educators who are working very diligently to create, to train teachers to teach history in a non-sectarian way, but much more importantly, I would argue, in a non-centered way, with not uber narrative, as one narrative, but rather to teach people to explore history as part of their daily life. And they do amazing things, especially in this climate in Lebanon.
Amazing. Okay, great. Well, our first question comes from Saleh. Saleh, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, congratulations for the success of the Romey lynchings documentary. My question is, do you have plans to translate Turath project into Arabic?
Yes. Thank you so much, Saleh, for that. We have actually finished translation. Right now we're in the editing phase. And we hope to have it all set up as an Arabic website by September.
Okay, great. The next question comes from my dad, who I will call Ibrahim for the formality. Dad, are you there?
Yes, I am here, but I'd rather you ask because I'm listening to you guys while I'm having iftar. So please go ahead and ask my question, which I wrote for you.
Okay, so his question is, do you agree that the social history tends to be slower than political history, hence little is written about it?
No, not necessarily. I mean, of course, it depends on what you mean by slower. That is, the question is social change slower than political change? And no, not necessarily, actually. I mean, Lebanon, obviously, would be a good example of the ossification of the political history of Lebanon, even as socially things are moving very fast. I think little has been written about social history for a variety of reasons. First of all, sources. Social history tends to be a little bit more complicated because social history is also about people on the margins, right? So for example, if I wanted to write a history of race in Lebanon, we don't talk very much about race in the Arab world, but race is very much part of the Arab world. It would be very difficult because the people I would want to write about aren't the people that are leaving records. So usually it's the people with power that are leaving the records. And we default to those because it's easier to access. So I think sources is part of the problem. Two, social history tends to be very activist kind of history. What I mean by that, social history is trying to take away the facade of systems that are giving power to one group over other groups. I don't care what group, whether it's race, religion, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, whatever you want to go with it. You know, within a social construct, there's always a hegemonic group and a group that is not as powerful or even worse, oppressed. So social history is about showing that, because more often than not, most societies create a very nice facade and you have to look behind it. But not only showing it, but also dismantling it. And in that sense, social history tends to be far more dangerous than political history. And it's very much, influenced by, things such as Marxist theory or Foucault and people like that.
So there's another question from Nadia, but before we get to it, I have a question about being a teacher. You have been a teacher at North Carolina State for multiple decades at this point. I don't know if I told you this, but I did my undergraduate in North Carolina at Duke, and I arrived in 2003 as a 17-year-old, 2 years after 9/11, straight from Beirut, and was shocked at the amount of anti-Arab sentiment. Have you seen a change over the good, bad, different? How has sort of sentiment towards the Arab world, towards Arab Americans changed over those decades?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And by the way, since your father is on the call, I'm just going to embarrass you a little bit. Ibrahim, I think you should be very proud of Mikey. I mean, he's really a remarkable man. And not only because he's interviewing me, although I appreciate that very much, but because he's really doing something that is very profound and transformative. Okay, so I think this is one of the things that, I talk a lot about, is that Arabs exist in a liminal state in the United States. We are, on one hand, accepted. So, for example, in the census, we're considered white. But on the other hand, we're absolutely maligned. For those of you who are with us today, just go to YouTube and search Planet of the Arabs. And you will find a 10-minute collage, a little dated now, of course, of films from the early silent era to the 1990s, in which Arabs only appear as the villains. And this is not happenstance. It's part of that Orientalist tradition in which the West has looked upon the Middle East as its opponent, as its contrary, and as it's beneath it hierarchically. It's also been fed by an industry that is, to be very blunt, pro-Israel and anti-Muslim. But there's certainly, I have to say, 9/11 magnified and crystallized that a lot more for me, where before, you would see that kind of anti-Arab sentiment, of course. After 9/11, almost like somebody gave people license to be even more racist against Arabs. Yeah. But at the same time, I have to say more positively, is that the Arab American community itself is much more activist, especially the younger generation, which I look upon with admiration and I applaud. They are creating new alliances across ethnic states. So with Black Lives Movement, with Latinx, with LGBTQ communities. So I think where before the early generation, the 19-teens and 20s, a lot of people wanted to become white because of the privilege that would bring them and the safety. Now you see with Arab Americans, this cross-ethnic alliances that I think is much more effective in the face of anti-Arab racism. Yeah.
The story about the lynching, I think, speaks to the safety part of it. I think there's a almost like an embarrassment that that generation of immigrants wanted to register themselves as white. But when you understand the context, you say, okay, this was a matter of life and death. So, all right, Marianne, you're up next.
Good morning. I hope all's well at your end. I recently watched Eliminate All the Brutes, and I'm hoping that many of you watched it because it's an incredibly powerful documentary in 4 parts. But when I was listening to you talk about your own work, are there particular narratives or narratives that you would supplant or rather empower missing links in your own research that you would like to use as subject matter for a documentary?
Could you, sorry, I haven't watched the documentary, so perhaps you can give me a little bit more background.
Eliminate All the Brutes is a 4-part series that looks at, in essence, global racism and the supplanting of histories that actually inform the current state of affairs in the world around suprematist actions. It's a really powerful and it's really visually driven narrative. The filmmaker, he made, let's see, what would be, I mean, he's made so many films. He's Haitian, so he includes the Haitian uprising as an example of successful backlash against racism. But what I was thinking of when I was listening to you is that documentary is still up. And so if people haven't seen it, I hope you will watch it. But in my own family, we have a narrative that comes out of Paris, Texas, where a Lebanese community was run out of town along with the Black community. And so I'm wondering if there are these little, I don't know how I'm asking this question, and
I know what you're saying, actually. I get the context, and I really appreciate it, and I will watch the documentary. So for me, at this point, yeah, we are continuing to look for these stories. Our next documentary is actually about two doctors, one in Oklahoma and one in Texas, from the 30s to the 50s, that basically buck the American Medical Association and try to bring accessible and affordable healthcare to racially and economically marginalized groups. So we are continuing with that. But also on the flip side, we're very interested in racism within the community itself. So we not only are examining how there's pressure on the community from outside, but there's a conversation that needs to be had about how the community itself sometimes has internalized some of these racialized attitudes and how they look upon others, especially African Americans, with disdain in the early period. And so I think we're looking at those dynamics. We're also very interested in, and we're working on this new project about the LGBTQ community. There's very little that's been done about the LGBTQ community historically, and they're kind of completely elided from the history. And we want to bring them in, and we have a project about one particular individual who's amazing, and her work as a lesbian in the early 1920s or 30s. So we are constantly looking for these to flesh out the story and show that intersectionality. I'm afraid we're getting close to running out of time, so I want to be quiet.
Thank you so
Of
much.
course.
Thanks, Mickey.
Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Marianne. Thanks to all the questions. And Akram, thank you so much for joining today. I will ask you one final question. If there's a specific book that you think people should check out that is a good sort of entryway into understanding the story of the sort of diaspora studies, that's maybe a good first step to leave us with for those who are uninitiated, maybe.
You're talking about diaspora studies in general, or specifically within?
No, coming out of the Arab world into the U.S. or into sort of the Americas more broadly.
Yeah, actually, there's a book by Andrew Arsan about West Africa and immigrants to West Africa, which I tend to. Yeah, it's actually an excellent work. It's a very scholarly piece, so there's a lot of theoretical framing in it. So it may be a little bit hard going at times, but it certainly would be a book that I would highly recommend. Of course, I would say my book is a good entry as well, Inventing Home. But also, I think there's a new book, and it's called Between the Ottomans and Entente, and that's by Stacy Farnthold, and it's about World War I and basically how the diaspora in South America and North America was dealing with World War I as it unfolded in the Middle East, and then of course with the creation of Lebanon and Syria, and shows the intimate link between the two. So I think that's another way. But there is really no general book overall that I would say, but these three would be good entryways.
Okay, perfect. Well, Akram, this has been a real thrill for me and a real pleasure to speak to you. I admire your work tremendously, and so it's really, really great to have you on the series. And thank you to everyone who joined. Please give us feedback. The link is in the chat. I'll paste it again. If you are interested in supporting our work, as always, become one of our community supporters who make this work possible. Keep these sessions free and open to all. We have another talk on Thursday as well, so check it out and see you at the next one.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.